Now, if you were to think of the Lusíads as a kind of map of the world, a conception, how would you describe the world as it looks to this epic?
It's a fascinating, fascinating question because the spatial imagery in the Lusíads is very complex. I mentioned earlier Ptolemy, and in a way, we have already here two different sets of maps and two cartographic epistemologies, as it were. We have, on the one hand, the very practical portolan charts used by navigators who use the ports to navigate from one place to another, and the coastal line that is really very, very minutely delineated. On the other hand, we have Ptolemy, and Ptolemy is very present from stanza 1 to canto 10, where Thetis, the nymph Thetis, actually shows to Vasco da Gama what was a Ptolemaic world. And the Ptolemaic world is a world of three continents. It's a world of the oikoumene, of what the Greeks called oikoumene, namely the three continents centered around the Mediterranean Sea, Africa, Asia, and Europe. And if we look closely at the Lusíads, we see that hardly ever does Camões reference the New World. The New World appears in Canto 10. There is a very brief reference to Tenochtitlan and a very brief reference to Magellan. However, it is really about the discovery of continents that were known to Ptolemy. So there is this cartographic imagery, and then we have yet another layer, namely the zonal map, which is a tradition that comes from Macrobius and which delineates the world and divides the world not into continents but into zones, climatic zones. So we have several references actually to the torrid zone. And interestingly, during the Renaissance, there was a tradition also to think, and during the Middle Ages, to think about the world not as divided into continents, but into inhabited and uninhabited zones. So in a way, Vasco da Gama traverses the torrid zone, what was then thought of as the torrid zone around the equator. His effort is even greater because he goes beyond very inhospitable climatic zones. So we have a conflation of all these spatial and cartographic images and
ecological sort of imagination,
and also ecological imagination.
Even so, the sort of storminess of the southern tip of Africa and Adamastor. This is also about the kind of fierceness of this part of the world that he's able to go through.
Absolutely, and of course, it is a fantasy also. It is a fantasy of discovery, because while Camões says that these seas had never been explored before,
of course they had been.
Vasco da Gama is the first one, and the Portuguese sailor is the first one. Actually, Vasco da Gama sails across oceans that are full with people. There are Arab merchants. There were a lot of Chinese.
And he needs guides, right? He gets guidance from people who know these areas perfectly well.
Absolutely. He needs guides whom he finds in Africa and Malindi, translators, and people who are familiar with the Indian Ocean. So it is a fantasy that Camões proposes here, the fantasy that Europeans actually explore these parts of the world. And it is a fantasy that had very strong implications because it established a myth that actually the Renaissance is a European invention. And that the Europeans were the first explorers of the world. So it is a global epic, and yet it is at the same time maybe the first global myth-producing epic and the first European global fantasy, a fantasy of empire. And it is also a cautionary tale. If we think of Adamastor, the monster Adamastor is really a retired sailor. He says, I was Lord of the Seas. And look what has become of me. And the epic ends with Thetis explaining the future deeds to Vasco da Gama, how many battles there will be, how many blood will be shed to uphold the empire.
As already at the beginning of the voyage, the old man of Belém essentially says, watch out for what you're getting into.
Yes. The so-called old man of Restelo or of Belém says that, you shouldn't do that. The sea is a dangerous endeavor. Just don't try to go beyond your human force and your human boundaries. So a lot of critics have thought that maybe Camões is actually expressing his own opinion.
On the other hand, he seems to be urging the king to go and conquer Africa.
Yes.
How do you put these two things together?
Well, the complexity of this poem is really that Camões writes at a time when the Portuguese Empire was not at its height anymore. The events that Camões describes took place in the very last years of the 15th century. Camões published this and wrote this poem in the 60s. It was published in 1572. So a lot of time has elapsed, and a lot of things have happened. And there is a fierce competition between the Portuguese and the Spanish for dominion and for presence and influence across continents and seas. And if one reads the Lusíadas carefully, one notices also an anti-Castilian undertone. And very interestingly, the year Camões died in 1580, the Portuguese lost their autonomy. The Portuguese Empire was taken up by the Spanish Empire and incorporated into the Habsburg Empire under Philip II's rule. So very interestingly, while Camões sings about the prowesses and exploits of the Portuguese heroes, he was writing in a time when everything was really going downhill.
And partly because of the disastrous expedition of King Sebastian to North Africa, right?
Yes.
So many of the nobility are slaughtered or sold off into slavery.
Yes, this is correct. King Sebastian has remained a very tragic figure in the Portuguese imaginary, really. He was a king who became king at the age of 3. He died at the age of 24. And the poem is dedicated to King Sebastian, who died 4 years after the publication of the poem in the Battle of Alcázar-Quibir.
Trying to conquer this, to increase this reign.
To increase the Portuguese realm of influence. And he dies and leaves Portugal without heir. And this is the moment when Portugal becomes part of Spain.